She arrived with a letter and 2 babies, seeking a husband and a home, but found rejection and a merciless desert. What followed was a journey of tears, courage, and an unlikely love that defied all expectations. Secrets were unearthed, lives transformed, and the fate of an entire town changed forever. Prepare yourself, for this story of overcoming adversity and redemption will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment where you are watching from. At the break of dawn, when the wind still whispered ancient secrets through the cracks in the rocks and the hesitant light painted the sky in pale shades of pink and orange, the iron and smoke monster finally yielded its momentum, stopping with a metallic groan at the small station of Broken Hope. The town's name, painted on a faded, crooked wooden sign, seemed more like a cruel irony than a promise. Elizabeth descended the steps of the train car with the caution of someone stepping onto a minefield, her body aching from the long journey, her soul even more so. In her arms, 2 identical bundles, Leo and Mia, her children, her treasures, her burdens. The low cry of one of them was a sharp counterpoint to the oppressive silence of the platform. The air smelled of dust accumulated over ages, the dry wood of the few buildings, and the strong, earthy odor of horses tied to a nearby post. The sun, still low, already promised a day of unmerciful heat, a prelude to the harshness of that land forgotten by God and men. The letter, stained by the fine sand that infiltrated everything, crumpled by her anxious and then desperate hands, was tucked close to her chest, a physical reminder of the promise that had brought her there. A promise of a new beginning, of a home, of a husband named Bartholomew, who, according to the carefully written words, would be waiting for her. And he was waiting. A man with broad shoulders, a face weathered by the sun and life, and a gaze that seemed capable of piercing the most resilient soul. He was leaning against one of the pillars of the station's precarious shelter, his wide-brimmed hat shading his eyes. When Elizabeth approached, hesitant, the babies now both whimpering softly, the man straightened up. His eyes swept over her from head to toe, lingering on the 2 small volumes in her arms. His jaw hardened, and a visible pallor spread beneath his tan. Hope, once a living flame in Elizabeth's chest, was now just a stubborn ember, fighting against the icy wind of reality blowing from his gaze. His words, when they came, were few but heavy as stones, brutal in their simplicity. The letter spoke of a bride, a woman to help me on the ranch, to be my wife. It didn't mention this. He gestured towards the babies with poorly disguised contempt. Elizabeth felt the ground give way beneath her feet. The journey, the hardships, the almost childlike faith she had placed in that correspondence, it all collapsed. "They are my children, sir. I couldn't leave them." Her voice was a thread, trembling. "Their father? Where is he?" The question was an accusation. She swallowed hard. He is no longer with us." It was a half-truth, easier than the painful complexity of her story. The rancher, Bartholomew, let out a short, humorless laugh. "I don't care. I expected a wife, not a mother with baggage. I can't have you in my home, not like this." The rejection was public. A few curious onlookers, the station master, 1 or 2 drifters who always seemed to haunt places like that, watched with an interest that stung. Elizabeth's face burned, not from the sun, but from humiliation. She found herself adrift, the heat rising, the babies restless, the dust clinging to her sweaty skin. Bartholomew turned his back on her, a final gesture of repudiation, and walked towards a wagon she hadn't noticed before. He didn't look back. The sound of the wagon wheels moving away down the dusty street was the sound of her last hope draining away. Alone, in Broken Hope. The name now sounded like a cruel mockery. The twins' crying intensified, echoing her own anguish. She held them tight, seeking a comfort she couldn't find. The sun climbed relentlessly in the sky, and the small wooden platform felt like the mouth of a furnace. The station master, an old man with tired eyes, approached timidly. "Madam, you can't stay here. The next train isn't for 3 days, and it's heading east, where you came from, I suppose." Going east was not an option. There was nothing there for her but more misery and painful memories. She looked around at the small town that stretched beyond the station. a dusty main street, lined with faded facades, a saloon with swinging doors that creaked in the wind, a general store that seemed to be the heart of that godforsaken place. She needed to find refuge, anything. With the last vestiges of strength, Elizabeth thanked the station master and, balancing the babies, began to walk towards the town, each step a small victory against the despair that threatened to swallow her. The weight of her children, of her uncertain future, of the brutal rejection was almost unbearable. Guilt gnawed at her. She had dragged her innocence to this godforsaken place. The town of broken hope offered no better welcome than Bartholomew. Curious eyes followed her, some hostile, others merely speculative. Women peered from behind threadbare curtains. Men stopped their conversations to watch her pass. She was an event, an anomaly. A young woman, alone with 2 infants, was an easy target for judgment and whispers. She tried the general store, hoping to get some information, maybe temporary work, anything. The owner, a corpulent man in a dirty apron, looked at her with suspicion. Work? For a woman with 2 infants? What can you do besides that? He indicated the babies with a nod of his head. Humiliation was a constant companion. She asked for some milk for the babies, offering the few coins she had left. He sold it, but with the reluctance of someone doing an unwanted favor. The afternoon was fading, and panic began to set in more acutely. Where would they spend the night? The few boarding houses in town, if they could even be called that, certainly wouldn't accept her without money up front, and with the babies. As she wandered to the edge of town, where the houses became more sparse and dilapidated, she saw a small abandoned cabin, almost in ruins, a little way off the main road, near a nearly dry creek bed. The windows were broken. The door hung from a single rusted hinge, but it was a roof. With a heavy heart but with no other alternative, Elizabeth entered. The interior was gloomy and smelled of mold and abandonment. There were cobwebs everywhere, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris. But it was shelter from the cold wind that began to blow with the falling night, and more importantly, from the stares of the town. She cleaned a corner as best she could with her hands and a torn piece of cloth she found, and settled the twins on her spread-out shawl. They were hungry and tired, and their crying was weak, almost a lament. As she tried to soothe them, she heard a noise outside. Her heart leaped. Animals? Or worse, someone from town. She held her breath. Footsteps approached. The door creaked even more as it was pushed open. A tall man stood in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the weak twilight. Elizabeth shrank back, instinctively shielding the babies. The man said nothing for a moment, just observed the scene. Then, in a calm voice which contrasted with the tension of the moment, he spoke. "Madam, are you all right?" It wasn't Bartholomew's voice. This one was softer, less harsh. Elizabeth couldn't answer, fear still paralyzing her. He took a step inside, and she could see his face. He was younger than Bartholomew, with firm features but a gaze that seemed kind. He carried a small bucket and a bundle. "I saw you at the station earlier, and I saw when when he left you." He cleared his throat. "My name is Daniel. I'm the blacksmith in town." He paused, as if waiting for a reaction. Elizabeth just stared at him, suspicious. "I brought some fresh water from my well, and a little bread and cheese. And I thought perhaps the babies might need milk. I have a goat that recently kidded." He held out the bucket and the bundle. It was the first gesture of genuine kindness she had received since arriving. Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes, hot and sudden. She tried to hold them back, but the exhaustion and the momentary relief were too much. I don't know how to thank you," she managed to say. Her voice choked. Daniel smiled slightly. "You don't have to. No one deserves to be treated that way, especially with children." He placed the things on the ground. "This cabin isn't much, but it's better than nothing for now. I can try to fix the door tomorrow if you'd like." This was the first moment. The unexpected rescue. The kindness that bloomed in the midst of hostility. Elizabeth felt a tiny seed of hope. Not the grand hope that had brought her there, but a smaller, more personal hope that perhaps not all was lost. Perhaps there was a good soul in that arid land. The night fell cold and dark. The distant howls of coyotes were a constant reminder of the wildness that surrounded her. Fear was still a close companion, but the presence of the water and food and the memory of Daniel's gesture made it a little more bearable. She fed the babies the goat's milk, which they drank eagerly, and ate some bread and cheese, the first substantial food in many hours. The twins' crying finally ceased and they fell asleep, nestled against each other. Elizabeth sat on the cold floor listening to the sounds of the night, and for the first time since she arrived, allowed herself to truly cry, not just for the rejection, but for her own fragility and the immense responsibility she carried. The days that followed were a constant struggle for survival. Daniel kept his promise and fixed the cabin door, making it a little more secure. He appeared sporadically, bringing more milk for the babies, sometimes a little firewood for the small fire she kept outside to cook the little she could. He never stayed long, aware of the looks and whispers his presence there might generate. The town, with its sharp stares and cutting whispers, was an invisible cage, tightening around her each day, where every judgment was a new iron bar. Elizabeth tried to find work, anything. She offered to wash clothes, clean houses, but doors were slammed in her face. The mark of the woman with children of unknown father was a powerful stigma. Some churchwomen, moved by a calculated charity, occasionally left a little food at her door, but always accompanied by looks of disapproval and unsolicited advice about morality. Bartholomew, she learned from Daniel, had spread the story that he had been tricked, that she was a woman of dubious reputation. It was easier for him to paint that picture than to admit his own cruelty or lack of compassion. Elizabeth tried to ignore it, focusing on her children. Leo and Mia were her reason for continuing. Their toothless smiles, the way their tiny hands gripped her fingers, were small sunbeams in the darkness. She spent her days caring for them, washing their few clothes in the creek, trying to keep the cabin minimally habitable. Loneliness was her constant companion, broken only by Daniel's brief visits and the cries and laughter of her babies. One afternoon, Daniel appeared with a piece of leather and some tools. "I noticed your shoes are very worn," he said awkwardly. "And the babies, well, they'll need something to protect their feet when they start crawling around." Elizabeth was touched by his consideration. As he worked on the leather, shaping small boots for the twins, she watched his large, skillful hands. They were a blacksmith's hands, calloused and strong, but they moved with surprising delicacy. She noticed his work gloves were torn in several places. That night, after the babies fell asleep, Elizabeth took a needle and thread she had brought in her bag and, by the faint light of an improvised candle, began to mend Daniel's gloves. It was a small job, but she did it carefully, each stitch a silent expression of gratitude. The next day, when he came to bring the milk, she handed him the mended gloves. He seemed surprised, then a genuine smile lit up his face. "You didn't have to do that, Elizabeth. You didn't have to make shoes for my children either," she replied, a slight blush on her cheeks. He held the gloves, examining the patches. "You have skilled hands." It was a simple moment, the exchange of small gestures of care, but it built another bridge between them. He, in turn, a few days later, brought 2 small wooden birds, perfectly carved and sanded until they were smooth to the touch. "For Leo and Mia," he said, handing them to Elizabeth. "So they have something to play with." Her eyes shone. They were the first real toys her children had. The tension in town, however, did not decrease. The drought dragged on. The creek bed near Elizabeth's cabin was almost dry, and the town well was beginning to show signs of running out. Murmurs about the bad luck her arrival had brought began to circulate with more insistence. It was easier to blame an outsider than implacable nature itself. Bartholomew, in particular, seemed to fuel these rumors. He saw her as a stain on his reputation, a constant reminder of his decision and perhaps a lost opportunity, though he would never admit it. The first major crisis came with a dust storm. The sky darkened in the middle of the day, and the wind howled like a demon, carrying sand and debris that stung the skin and blinded the eyes. Elizabeth struggled to seal the gaps in the cabin with old cloths, her heart tight with fear for the babies, who coughed with the fine dust that infiltrated everywhere. The storm lasted for hours, a sensory assault that left everyone in town nervous and exhausted. When it finally passed, the landscape was transformed, covered in a sinister layer of reddish dust. The little Elizabeth had outside, some herbs she was trying to grow, the firewood Daniel had brought, was buried or scattered. It was Daniel who appeared first. His face covered in dust, his eyes worried. He helped her clean the cabin entrance and checked if the babies were all right. His presence was a rock in the midst of chaos. That night, sitting outside the cabin, under a sky strangely clear after the storm, they talked more openly than ever before. The small fire they managed to light cast dancing shadows on their faces. Elizabeth, feeling a need to connect, to be seen as more than just the woman with the twins, spoke a little about her life before Broken Hope. She spoke of the boy's father, a young dreamer who had fallen ill and died before he even knew about the pregnancy, leaving her alone and helpless. It wasn't the story of abandonment that the town whispered, but the truth was equally painful. Daniel listened in silence, his gaze understanding. He, in turn, shared a little of his own story. He spoke of a family lost in the East, of shattered dreams that had brought him to this isolated place seeking a kind of peace or perhaps just oblivion. "Sometimes," he said, looking at the flames, "I think all of us here in Broken Hope are running from something or looking for something we lost." That conversation, under the cloak of night and shared vulnerability, was a turning point. They were no longer just the kind blacksmith and the needy mother. They were two souls who had known pain and who found in each other a rare moment of understanding. The trust between them deepened, silent and strong as the roots of a tree in rocky soil. Months dragged on, turning the arid spring into an even more unmerciful summer. The drought persisted, and the town's mood soured in proportion to the drying wells. Water became a precious commodity, fought over. Elizabeth, with her cabin near the now completely dry creek bed, felt the pressure intensify. Daniel continued to help her, bringing water from his own well, which, being deeper, still held out. But even this generated malicious comments about favoritism. Bartholomew, now an even darker and more resentful figure, watched everything with a calculating eye. He saw the growing closeness between Elizabeth and Daniel, and it seemed to irritate him even more. Perhaps it was wounded pride or envy of a connection he himself had dismissed. One day, one of the twins, Leo, fell ill. A high fever consumed him, and he cried inconsolably. Elizabeth was desperate. There was no doctor in Broken Hope, only an old healer whose remedies were as dubious as her reputation. Daniel, upon learning of the situation, did not hesitate. He spent the night in the cabin with Elizabeth, helping her apply cold compresses to Leo's feverish forehead, trying to calm her as she held her small son. Fear etched on her face. They saw the sun rise together, exhausted, but Leo had finally begun to improve, the fever slowly receding. In the quiet of the early morning, as they watched over the boy's restless sleep, they shared a silence heavy with emotion. Elizabeth, her eyes red from crying and exhaustion, looked at Daniel and saw not just a benefactor, but a partner in her anguish. He, in turn, saw the indomitable strength of that mother, her fierce dedication. On that night of vigil and shared fear, they showed each other their vulnerability in a way that words never could. The final barrier between them seemed to crumble, replaced by a tacit and deep understanding. Leo's recovery brought immense relief, but the shadow of drought and scarcity hung over everyone. Rumors circulated that a group of outlaws, taking advantage of the disorder caused by the drought throughout the region, were attacking small properties and isolated settlements. The sheriff of the neighboring town, the closest with any real authority, was an absent and ineffective figure. The tension in Broken Hope was palpable. Danger, a hungry predator, circled the small community, and the air crackled with the electricity of fear, promising to tear the fragile peace with claws of fire and steel. People became more suspicious, more selfish. The few reserves of food and water were kept under lock and key. Bartholomew seized the situation to try, once again, to rid himself of Elizabeth. He argued in the saloon, for anyone who would listen, that her presence, an outsider with no ties to the community, was a risk. Who knows what kind of people she might attract, he insinuated. In times like these, we need to protect ourselves. Close ranks. Some agreed. Others, who had witnessed Elizabeth's quiet struggle and Daniel's kindness, hesitated. But fear is an effective sower of discord. One night, as Elizabeth was putting the twins to sleep, she heard a noise outside. It wasn't Daniel's familiar footsteps. They were furtive steps, accompanied by whispers. Her heart turned to ice. She peered through a crack in the door and saw two shadowy figures prowling around the cabin. One of them carried a torch. Panic overwhelmed her. Were they going to set the cabin on fire? With her and the babies inside? She grabbed a fireplace poker, the only weapon she possessed, her hands trembling. Before she could decide what to do, she heard Daniel's firm voice cutting through the night. "What do you think you're doing?" The men started, turning to face Daniel, who had emerged from the darkness like an avenging angel, an iron bar in his hand. "We were just checking things out, blacksmith," one of them stammered, the torch flickering. "Checking with fire?" Daniel retorted, his voice filled with contempt. "Get out of here, and if I see you near this cabin or this family again, you'll regret it." The men, clearly intimidated by Daniel's controlled fury and his reputation as a strong and just man, backed away and disappeared into the darkness. Daniel entered the cabin, his face still grim. Elizabeth was trembling so much she could barely stand. He steadied her, holding her arms. "Are you all right? Did they hurt you?" She shook her head, unable to speak. Tears streamed down her face. He held her close, a strong, protective embrace. "I won't let anything happen to you," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. That confrontation, the imminent threat, served as a catalyst. The town was on edge, and the greater danger was yet to come. The following days were filled with almost unbearable apprehension. The rumors about the outlaws were confirmed when a rancher from a neighboring property was found dead, his home looted and burned. Panic set in for good in broken hope. Some talked of fleeing, abandoning everything. Others, more stubborn or with nowhere to go, decided to resist. Daniel became a central figure in organizing the town's defense. His calm and determination inspired confidence. He and other men patrolled the streets at night, armed with what they had. Elizabeth, though terrified, refused to be a burden. She helped as she could, cooking for the patrolmen, mending clothes, caring for other people's children when the mothers needed to help with other tasks. Her silent resilience began to change some residents' perception of her. They now saw not the pariah, but a strong woman fighting to protect her family and her new, albeit precarious, community. Bartholomew kept his distance, sullen and isolated in his own bitterness, although even he seemed worried about the impending threat. The night the outlaws attacked was a new moon night, pitch black. The first sign was the frantic barking of dogs, followed by screams and the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Chaos erupted. Men ran through the streets, firing their weapons at the advancing shadows. The women and children were gathered in the general store, considered the safest building. Elizabeth was there, the twins clinging to her, her heart pounding like a runaway drum. The noise of the battle outside was terrifying. Cries of pain, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the intermittent flash of gunfire. Suddenly, one of the general store walls caught fire. Someone had thrown a torch. Panic turned into absolute terror. Smoke began to fill the place, suffocating. People ran, coughing, trying to find a way out. Elizabeth, with Leo in one arm and Mia in the other, struggled to see through the dense smoke. The main exit was blocked by flames. It was then she saw Daniel. He was at the back door, which he had managed to break open, fighting to keep a passage clear while helping people get out. His face was smudged with soot, an expression of fury and determination on it. He saw her. "Elizabeth, over here!" he yelled above the noise. She ran towards him, stumbling, the babies crying in fright. When she reached the door, a flaming beam collapsed, partially blocking the passage. There was only space for one person to squeeze through at a time, and with difficulty. Daniel pushed a woman and child out. "Elizabeth, go, take the babies!" But Elizabeth hesitated. Behind her, a mother with a baby in her arms was trapped, coughing violently. Without a second thought, Elizabeth handed Leo to Daniel. "Hold him, I'll help that woman." Before Daniel could protest, she turned, shifted Mia to her other arm, and facing the smoke and heat, helped the other mother to her feet and guided her towards the small opening. Daniel, with Leo safe, helped pull them out. As soon as the other mother and her baby were safe, Elizabeth turned to get Mia back. But at that instant, part of the burning roof collapsed exactly where she had been standing. Daniel screamed her name, a cry of pure agony. For a moment, it seemed all was lost. But then, from the smoke and rubble, Elizabeth emerged, coughing, singed but alive, dragging Mia, who, miraculously, was only frightened. Daniel ran to her, took Mia, and held her tight. A hug that spoke of fear, relief, and a love that no longer needed words. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "You're crazy," he said, his voice choked. "And the bravest woman I've ever met." That act of sacrifice, her courage in the face of extreme danger, not just for her children, but for someone else, solidified the bond between them in an indelible way. The battle outside still raged, but in that moment, amidst the chaos and destruction, they found each other. The fight against the outlaws lasted almost all night. Many were wounded, and some lost their lives. But thanks to the bravery and unexpected unity of the residents, the bandits were repelled, leaving behind their dead and wounded. At dawn, Broken Hope was a wounded town, scarred, but not defeated. The sun rose over a scene of destruction, but also of new hope. The dust of battle settled slowly, revealing the extent of the damage and losses. The general store was partially destroyed, some houses had been burned, and sadness hung in the air along with the smell of smoke. But something else had changed. The ordeal had united the community in a way that peace never could. The barriers of distrust had been torn down by mutual need and shared heroism. Elizabeth and Daniel emerged from that night as central figures, not by their own desire, but by the strength of their actions. Elizabeth's courage in helping the other mother in the general store fire became a story told in hushed tones, with admiration. Daniel, through his leadership and bravery, had earned everyone's respect. Even Bartholomew seemed different. He had fought alongside the other men, and the experience seemed to have shaken him, perhaps even humanized him a little. He watched Elizabeth from a distance, an unreadable expression on his face. There was no longer contempt, perhaps an incipient regret, or just the realization that he had judged wrongly. In the days that followed, the town began the slow process of reconstruction. Hands that had once closed in distrust now joined to raise beams and clear rubble. Elizabeth, with Leo and Mia now a little older and more curious, participated actively. She helped care for the wounded, prepare communal food, offer comfort. She was no longer the outsider, the pariah. She was one of them. One afternoon, while helping to clean what was left of the general store, Bartholomew approached her. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly since the day of her arrival. "Madam Elizabeth," he began, his voice hoarse, his hat in his hand. I wanted to say that I was a fool and a cruel man." Elizabeth stopped what she was doing and stared at him, surprised. "You showed more courage and decency than many who were born and raised here. I was wrong." He looked at the ground, then back at her. If you would still consider it the offer of a place to live, a safe place for you and your children. My ranch is still standing. It would be an honor to have you there, as a friend." It was a surprising offer, an apology in his own way. Elizabeth considered his words. There was a sincerity in his voice she hadn't expected, but her path was now different. "I appreciate your words, Sir Bartholomew, and your offer, but I think I've found my place here." She looked in Daniel's direction, where he was helping to raise a new wall, and smiled slightly. Bartholomew followed her gaze and seemed to understand. He nodded, a shadow of sadness in his eyes. "I understand. I wish you happiness, madam. You deserve it." He walked away, leaving Elizabeth with a sense of closure. That ghost from the past was finally exorcised. The reconstruction of the town progressed, and with it, the reconstruction of lives. Daniel and Elizabeth spent more and more time together, their relationship blossoming naturally without haste, nurtured by mutual respect and the love that had grown amidst adversity. The love that bloomed between them was like a stubborn fig tree in the desert, sinking deep roots into the aridity of hardship, promising shade and fruit, where before there had only been desolation. One night, sitting on the porch of the small house Daniel had begun building for them, a little away from the town center, but not as isolated as the old cabin, they watched the stars. Leo and Mia slept peacefully inside. "Did you think of a name for this place?" Elizabeth asked, resting her head on his shoulder. Daniel smiled. "I thought of New Beginning, or maybe Home Sweet Home, but that seems a bit cliché." Elizabeth laughed. "I like New Beginning." He kissed her gently. "Then New Beginning it will be, our new beginning." There was no formal proposal, it wasn't necessary. Their commitment was deeper than words or ceremonies. It was a commitment forged in fire, in loss, and in the rediscovery of hope. Broken Hope, the town, was also changing. The name was still the same, but its meaning was beginning to transform. For Elizabeth, it was no longer a place of rejection, but the place where she had found strength, community, and love. The future, once a dark and threatening canvas, was beginning to be painted with the timid colors of a new dawn, promising gentler days. The twins would grow up in that land, not under the shadow of an uncertain past, but under the sun of a present built with courage and the light of a promising future. The sand-stained letter, which had brought her to that improbable destiny, was still kept, but now it was merely a relic of a distant time, the prologue to a story much larger and richer than she could ever have imagined when she stepped off that train, alone, with 2 babies in her arms and a heart full of fear and a small, stubborn hope. And that hope, after all, had not been broken. It had simply found more fertile ground to flourish.